By the time American Special Forces teams had settled into their work in Vietnam, they were already experienced soldiers operating far from conventional battlefields, men who were comfortable living out of rucksacks, working with local forces, and moving through terrain that punished mistakes quickly. And they approached the jungle with confidence that came from training, adaptability, and a belief that if something needed to be done, it could usually be done faster by pushing harder. Their patrols moved with purpose, covering ground efficiently, maintaining forward momentum, keeping schedules tight, and measuring success in distances traveled, villages reached, and contacts avoided or resolved. And in many parts of Vietnam, that approach worked well enough to feel validated, especially when paired with air mobility and strong support networks that rewarded speed and decisiveness. When Australian SAS patrols began operating in nearby areas, the contrast was not immediately flattering. From the outside, their movement looked slow, almost hesitant, as if they were constantly stopping, reassessing, and then stopping again, sometimes covering what felt like very little ground over an entire day. And to men used to driving missions forward, this raised quiet questions about efficiency, exposure, and whether such a pace made sense in a war where time often felt like the most precious resource. The jungle, however, did not care about schedules. In Vietnam, sound traveled unpredictably, sometimes carrying much farther than expected, sometimes disappearing altogether. And the jungle floor recorded movement in ways that were not obvious to someone passing through once, but became unmistakable over time, especially when men moved the same way, at the same speed, with the same habits day after day. American teams were not careless, but they were conditioned to believe that disciplined movement and momentum reduced risk, that staying ahead of the environment mattered, and that slowing down too much invited problems of its own, including fatigue, frustration, and loss of initiative. The Australians seemed to accept those problems as part of the cost. Their patrols paused often, not just to rest, but to listen, to observe, and to let the environment settle around them again. And when they moved, they did so in a way that appeared almost deliberate to the point of discomfort, placing feet carefully, adjusting spacing constantly, and showing little interest in reaching a destination quickly if the route itself raised questions. To American eyes, it sometimes looked like indecision. What complicated that perception was the outcome. Australian patrols were being contacted less frequently in certain areas. And when they were contacted, the engagements were often brief and controlled. While nearby American units operating at a faster pace were seeing more sudden encounters that seemed to come without warning, even when their movement discipline was solid and their procedures sound. At first, this difference was easy to explain away. Different missions, different priorities, different operating styles, and different expectations, all of which could account for differences in results without requiring deeper reflection. And in a war filled with variables, it was always tempting to attribute outcomes to chance or context rather than method. But over time, the pattern became harder to ignore. The Australians were not just slower. They were quieter, in ways that went beyond noise discipline. And they were harder to predict, not because they were hiding better in the moment, but because they did not move in ways that left an obvious rhythm behind them. Their pace was not accidental. It was a choice. What American teams began to notice, sometimes reluctantly, was that jungle pace was not about how fast you could move when things went right, but about how little information you left behind when things went wrong. And that was not how most U.S. units had been trained to think about movement. Speed felt like control. Slowness felt like vulnerability. Yet the jungle inverted that logic. Moving faster meant brushing more vegetation, compressing more ground, disturbing more of the environment in a shorter span of time, and doing so repeatedly in similar ways. While moving slower forced decisions, limited repetition, and made it easier to notice when something felt out of place before it turned into contact. This difference did not present itself as a formal lesson or a doctrinal disagreement. It appeared in small moments. An Australian patrol choosing to stop short of a seemingly ideal rest point, while an American patrol pushed through to reach it. An Australian team taking a longer, less direct route around terrain that looked passable, while an American team moved straight through it without hesitation. An Australian patrol ending a day having covered less ground, but with a clearer sense of who might be watching and from where. For Green Berets used to operating with initiative and confidence, this raised an uncomfortable question: whether their pace was actually making them more visible over time, even when each individual movement felt correct. No one announced this question openly at first. It surfaced through observation, quiet conversations, and shared operations where differences became impossible to ignore, especially when American teams began accompanying Australian patrols and experienced the pace firsthand. The frustration was immediate. Slowing down felt like giving something up, like abandoning momentum. And for men trained to solve problems through action, it tested patience in ways that were not easy to articulate, especially when the mission clock was still running and objectives still mattered. What made the tension sharper was that the Australians did not frame their pace as superior or clever. They treated it as normal. There was no emphasis placed on it, no explanations offered unless asked. It was simply how they moved, how they planned, and how they expected the jungle to be approached, with the assumption that anything done too quickly would need to be paid for later. That assumption challenged something fundamental. American Special Forces culture valued adaptability and initiative, but it also valued efficiency. And efficiency often meant doing more in less time, while the Australian approach suggested that doing less, more deliberately, could actually produce better results in an environment that rewarded patience more than speed. This was not about courage or competence. Both groups were professional, experienced, and capable. The difference lay in what each believed the jungle punished most severely. For the Australians, the greatest danger was repetition, rhythm, and predictability, and pace was the first line of defense against those things. For the Green Berets, the idea that slowing down could reduce risk rather than increase it ran against instinct, training, and years of reinforcement, and it was not a lesson that could be absorbed by explanation alone. It had to be experienced. And that experience was about to test assumptions that had felt solid until the jungle began quietly proving otherwise. When Green Berets first tried to match the Australian jungle pace, the adjustment felt awkward almost immediately, not because the movement itself was difficult, but because it disrupted instincts that had been reinforced for years. Instincts built around momentum, timing, and the quiet confidence that came from covering ground efficiently and keeping a mission moving forward. Slowing down changed everything in ways that were not obvious at first. Steps became deliberate rather than automatic. Spacing between men shifted constantly, and pauses that would normally feel unnecessary began to stretch longer than expected, creating a low-level tension that was hard to ignore, because doing less felt like falling behind even when nothing was actually going wrong. What surprised many of the Americans was how mentally demanding the slower pace turned out to be. Moving quickly allowed attention to narrow, focusing on direction and timing, but moving slowly required constant awareness of sound, of ground texture, of subtle changes in vegetation, of small inconsistencies that were easy to miss when momentum carried you forward, and that level of focus was exhausting in a different way. The Australians did not rush these moments. They stopped often, sometimes without any visible reason, letting the jungle settle, listening not just for noise but for absence, for patterns that did not fit, for small details that suggested someone else had passed through recently. And these pauses were not random. They were built into the rhythm of movement itself. For the Green Berets, this was frustrating. Every pause felt like exposure, as if standing still made them easier to see or target, even though experience would later show that rushed movement often left a clearer trail than controlled stillness. But at this stage, instinct argued against patience. The slower pace also made time feel different. Distances that would normally be covered before midday now stretched well into the afternoon, and objectives that once felt routine suddenly required recalculation. Not because they were harder to reach, but because the route itself demanded more attention than expected. At first, this seemed inefficient. The Americans were used to thinking of time as something to manage aggressively, especially in an environment where daylight mattered and fatigue accumulated quickly, and the idea of deliberately reducing speed felt like surrendering control rather than gaining it. What shifted that perception were the small details that began to surface. Moving slowly made it easier to notice signs that would have been dismissed at a faster pace, disturbed ground that did not match the surrounding area. Vegetation bent in ways that suggested repeated passage or subtle breaks in natural patterns that hinted at observation points or common routes. And once those details were noticed, they were difficult to unsee. The Australians treated these signs as conversations rather than warnings. They did not react immediately. They absorbed information, adjusted direction slightly, altered spacing, or changed timing, often without discussion, as if the response was instinctive rather than deliberate. And over time, the Americans began to understand that pace was what made this possible. At a faster speed, there was no margin to observe without stopping entirely. At a slower pace, observation became continuous. What also became clear was how pace affected predictability. Moving quickly encouraged direct routes because efficiency favored straight lines and familiar ground, while slowing down made indirect movement feel natural, even necessary, because speed was no longer the priority and variation became easier to justify. This change reduced repetition without anyone consciously planning for it. Routes varied naturally, entry points shifted, and exits changed without forcing the issue. Movement became less consistent not because it was chaotic, but because it was responsive. For Green Berets accustomed to making decisions early and sticking to them, this flexibility felt uncomfortable. Plans were adjusted mid-movement, and timelines were treated as estimates rather than targets. Decisions were revisited quietly as new information appeared, and that required a different kind of leadership, one that valued observation over momentum. The first few patrols conducted at the Australian pace often ended with mixed feelings. Men felt tired in unfamiliar ways, and progress seemed slow. It was frustrating when comparing distances covered against previous missions, and yet something else stood out as well. Contact felt different, and encounters felt less sudden. Patrols were more likely to sense something off beforehand, instead of walking into prepared positions. A change in atmosphere or a lack of normal jungle noise, and even when contact did happen, it often felt less controlled by whoever had been waiting. This did not mean the jungle became safe, but that the balance shifted slightly. The Australians never framed this as a formula or a guarantee. They treated pace as a way of managing risk rather than eliminating it. And that distinction mattered because it set expectations properly. Slower movement reduced the enemy's ability to choose the moment with certainty. For American teams beginning to internalize this, the change was subtle but important. Success was no longer measured solely by objectives reached or ground covered. It was measured by how little the patrol revealed about itself over time. This idea took hold unevenly. Some Green Berets adapted quickly, recognizing that pace was a tool rather than a limitation, while others struggled longer, especially when operating under pressure or time constraints that made slower movement feel irresponsible. What made the difference was not skill, but trust. Trust that slowing down would reduce the danger. Trust that discomfort now prevented problems later, and that the jungle punished haste more reliably than patience. There was no instruction that created that trust. It formed over time as the results kept confirming the logic. And with each patrol conducted at the Australian pace, the logic behind it became harder to argue against, not because it sounded convincing, but because it kept making sense on the ground. As the slower pace stopped feeling like an experiment and started feeling like a workable option, something else changed almost without anyone consciously deciding it should. which was how Green Berets began thinking about planning itself. Because once movement slowed down, the assumptions that had shaped earlier patrol plans no longer held together in the same way. Plans became less rigid, not in purpose, but in execution. And instead of locking in routes early and treating them as commitments, leaders began leaving space for adjustment, assuming that what looked good on a map would probably look different once the jungle had a chance to respond. This shift mattered more than speed ever had. At a faster pace, decisions had to be made early, because changing them later cost time and energy, but at a slower pace, decisions could be deferred, tested, and revised quietly as conditions revealed themselves, which allowed patrol leaders to respond to information rather than push through it. Green Berets began noticing that when they slowed down, they did not just see more, they thought differently, because time was no longer something they were constantly fighting, and that mental space made it easier to recognize when a plan no longer fit the environment it was supposed to work in. One of the first changes was how routes were chosen. Instead of selecting the most direct path to an objective, patrol leaders began thinking about how a route would look after they had used it not just once, but multiple times, and whether it would begin to advertise their presence over days or weeks rather than hours. This naturally pushed movement away from obvious terrain features, away from clean lines, and away from places that invited repetition. Not because those places were always dangerous, but because they were easy to remember. The jungle rewarded forgettable movement. Spacing changed in quieter ways. Men stopped locking into fixed distances for long stretches, and spacing became something that adjusted constantly, expanding and contracting as vegetation, sound, and visibility changed, which reduced the sense of rhythm that faster patrols tended to fall into without realizing it. Even communication shifted. Hand signals replaced whispered instructions more often, and pauses were used deliberately to let small sounds emerge, not because something specific was expected, but because silence itself carried information once you stopped rushing past it. What made these changes stick was not theory, but consequence. Patrols that adopted the slower pace began noticing that they were less often surprised by sudden contact, not because the enemy had vanished, but because the patrol itself was no longer announcing its intentions through repetition and speed. Contact still happened, but it happened differently. Instead of walking into places where someone had clearly been waiting, patrols encountered resistance in less predictable ways, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, but rarely at points that felt perfectly prepared, and that difference mattered more than the number of engagements. The Australians never framed this as improvement. They treated it as normal behavior in an environment that punished predictability, and that quiet confidence made it easier for American teams to accept the change without feeling as though they were abandoning their own competence. Over time, Green Berets began applying the pace, even when operating alone. This was an important shift because it showed that the lesson had moved beyond imitation and into judgment. And once that happened, it started shaping decisions even before patrols stepped off. Patrol leaders began building extra time into missions, not as a buffer, but as an acknowledgement that movement itself was part of the problem to be solved, and that rushing toward an objective often created more exposure than delay ever did. This mindset affected how teams entered and exited areas. Instead of assuming the way in would also be the way out, patrols planned exits as separate problems, sometimes choosing routes that made little sense from a distance but reduced the chance of being anticipated. These decisions were rarely discussed at length. They were simply done. What surprised many Green Berets was how quickly this approach began influencing other aspects of their work. Working with local forces, for example, became more deliberate because moving too fast made it harder to judge reactions, intentions, and awareness, while slowing down created space for observation that had nothing to do with the jungle itself. The slower pace also changed how fatigue was managed. Moving fast burned energy quickly and often forced longer stops later, while slower, steadier movement spread effort more evenly, reducing the need for obvious rest points that tended to become predictable over time. This was not something anyone would have expected at first, and it challenged assumptions about efficiency that had felt solid. There was still resistance, especially under pressure. Time-sensitive missions did not disappear, and there were moments when speed was unavoidable. But even then, the awareness remained, and leaders began asking whether speed was actually solving the problem or simply postponing it. The jungle made this distinction unavoidable. Every patrol left behind evidence whether it intended to or not, and the slower pace reduced the clarity of that evidence by breaking rhythm, varying direction, and limiting repetition. Not perfectly, but enough to matter. What emerged was not a new doctrine, but a different relationship with time. Time was no longer something to be beaten. It was something to be used. And once that idea took hold, the way Green Berets approached jungle movement stopped looking like a compromise and started looking like an advantage, not because it was dramatic or clever, but because it aligned with how the environment actually worked. This was the point where the lesson stopped belonging to the Australians. It became part of how experienced teams operated regardless of who had introduced it, because it solved a problem the jungle kept presenting again and again to anyone willing to notice. The pace was no longer foreign. It was simply appropriate. And that understanding quietly reshaped how Green Berets thought about movement long after the novelty of working alongside the Australians had worn off. What made the change in pace truly stick was not that it worked once or twice, but that it kept solving the same problem in slightly different ways over time, which forced Green Berets to confront an uncomfortable truth about jungle operations that had little to do with nationality, unit culture, or even doctrine, and everything to do with how human behavior interacts with an environment that records habits relentlessly. The jungle did not reward decisiveness in the way open terrain did, and it did not punish hesitation in the way urban fighting often did. Instead, it punished consistency, especially when that consistency came from doing things that felt efficient, logical, or proven, because efficiency tends to create rhythm. And rhythm is exactly what an observant opponent needs in order to stop reacting and start preparing. Once Green Berets began operating at the Australian pace, as a matter of judgment rather than imitation, they also began noticing how often earlier assumptions about risk had been inverted, since moving quickly had always felt safer because it reduced time spent exposed, while slowing down felt dangerous because it seemed to increase vulnerability. Yet in practice, the slower pace reduced the kind of exposure that mattered most, which was not being seen in the moment, but being understood over time. This realization extended beyond movement speed and into how patrols thought about presence itself, because presence was not just about where you were, but about how predictable you were in getting there, how predictable you were in leaving, and how often your decisions lined up with what someone else would reasonably expect you to do next. And once that idea took hold, pace became one of the easiest variables to manipulate without changing mission intent or capability. What also became clear was that the slower pace did not actually reduce effectiveness, as many had initially feared, but redistributed effort in a way that made outcomes more stable, since faster movement often produced quick progress, followed by sharp friction, while slower movement tended to smooth those spikes by catching problems earlier, when they were still manageable rather than sudden. Over time, this influenced how Green Berets thought about initiative, because initiative no longer meant pushing forward aggressively, but choosing when not to push. And that distinction mattered in a war where reacting too quickly often revealed more than it solved, especially in environments where observation favored whoever was willing to wait. The Australians had never framed their pace as a lesson to be taught, which may be why it was absorbed more effectively than many formal instructions, because it was experienced rather than explained, and because it came without the pressure of proving one approach superior to another, leaving room for American teams to adopt it, without feeling that they were conceding competence or abandoning their own identity. As this way of moving became normal, it also stripped away some of the mystique that initially surrounded it. revealing that jungle pace was not a trick or a formula, but a mindset that treated time as part of the terrain, something to be shaped and worked with rather than overcome. And once that mindset was in place, speed became a choice instead of a default. What endured was not the specific pace itself, but the habit of questioning pace, of asking whether moving faster actually reduced risk in that moment, or simply satisfied an internal sense of urgency. And this habit proved useful far beyond Vietnam because it applied wherever movement could be watched, patterns could be learned, and repetition could be exploited. The lesson was quiet, which is why it lasted, because it did not depend on memory of a particular patrol or a specific outcome, but on repeated confirmation that slowing down changed what the enemy could know. And once that connection was understood, it became difficult to unsee, even when operating in different environments or under different constraints. In the end, what Green Berets took from the Australian SAS jungle pace was not a speed to copy, but a way of thinking about exposure, predictability, and control that reframed movement as something that needed to be protected rather than optimized. And that shift, subtle as it was, altered how experienced teams approached uncertainty in environments where being understood was often more dangerous than being seen. That understanding did not announce itself as a breakthrough, and it did not arrive all at once. But it persisted precisely because it aligned with how the jungle behaved over time, rewarding those who resisted the urge to rush and punishing those who mistook momentum for safety, leaving behind a lesson that felt obvious only after it had been learned the hard way. Please subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the video. I put a lot of effort to bring you factually correct and lesser-known stories of the past. And do let me know if you have any feedback or suggestions.